This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Ivan the Troll. He is one of the most well-known 3D printed gun advocates. He's behind many of the new designs, and he's going to be talking to us about this new thing he has, which has caused some controversy, the Plastikov, which is basically parts for a 3D printed, no serial assault rifle. And he's going to also be talking about the so-called renaissance of 3D printed guns. Obviously, this will not be for everyone, but we don't all need to agree on everything. Have a listen, it's very interesting. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front and you want more, please do consider subscribing on the Patreon. It supports us. Go to patreon.com/popularfront, or you can go to popularfront.co/support. Before we get into all of this 3D printed gun stuff, I want to talk firstly about this new, what is essentially a 3D printed rifle, or at least the parts for it, the Plastikov. Tell us, what is that?
Yeah, so, in the 3D printed gun world, at least early on, the vast majority of the development sort of circled around the AR-15, at least here in America. And I guess answering this question sort of necessitates me disclaim the fact, like, in the U.S., there's only one part of any given gun that's actually defined and federally regulated as the firearm. So for AR-15s, this is the lower receiver. For like Glock handguns, it's the frame. For AK-style rifles, it's the receiver. They don't have upper and lower receivers. They just have a receiver. Sort of like more traditional rifles were all built this way. So in the United States, just that receiver on an AK is considered a firearm. Everything else to the government is just spare parts, can be ordered, no serial number, background check, no federal regulation at all on your way as far as ordering those parts. So, the early development of these sort of 3D printed guns, at least when it came to, just the firearms components, I'll refer to them as firearm components. So when I mean that, and I'll call them like a 3D printed firearm, I'm usually going to be referring to just the receiver component, that loophole in U.S. law. So the AR-15s had a lot of development. So a lot of work went into 3D printable AR-15 lowers, them being the only federally regulated component. And for a long time, everybody believed that, there's no way that you could actually pull off doing an AK receiver. The belief is AR-15 lowers, people would parrot this point that, they don't see a lot of the force of the gun actually cycling. They're not actually under any, people would constantly say they're not under any stress, which, like from an engineering standpoint, isn't necessarily true. They're not under a lot of stress when you consider some of the other parts in the firearm, but they are under some stress. And people would say, AK is far too violent of an action. There's far too much stress the receiver sees. And so that was like a given point for some time. And it was after, I guess there's technically a startup company called DNO. There's a guy named Eric who is the founder of that company, and they had managed to get an AK-style receiver where it was like their own proprietary homebrew setup that requires like permanently modifying an actual, AKM parts kit. But it would, they demonstrated a 3D printed receiver for an AK, and they ran like, 400 rounds through it before it started to fall apart. But they had designed this receiver originally for milled aluminum. So, it worked pretty well in 3D printed 3D printed nylon is what they had used. And so that sort of opened my eyes to the fact, like, okay, it wouldn't actually just be like a wild goose chase to pull this off. You saw it on video. It actually worked kind of well. So I didn't want to follow their sort of proprietary pattern. So with the Plastikov, I consulted with another developer, that being Freeman Don't Ask, who did essentially all the work on the printable Glock frames. And I consulted with him a little bit for advice on the AK platform. But, I ended up putting together, it's an actual AKM pattern. So the DNO AK followed their own specific pattern. So you had to modify, permanently modify AK parts. Mine takes essentially any AKM parts kit, and the AKM is the descendant of the AK-47. So the AK-47 used milled receivers, and what most people call an AK-47 is in actuality an AKM. And the AKM just uses a stamped receiver, and the parts inside the receiver are riveted and pinned in place. So the Plastikov uses these AKM parts kits, which at least in America, they're drying up now, but 10 years prior to now, they were like all over. Like you'd trip over them in the US, and they were cheap and all over the place. And they're getting more expensive and harder to find now, which is kind of unfortunate, at least for me. But these parts kits you can take and then put them inside of a Plastikov. And I mean, I can't make claims that the Plastikov, being this 3D printed AKM receiver, is stronger than like building an AK the proper way, because it definitely isn't. But it ends up being a lot cheaper because, of course, AKM receivers are like riveted together, and riveting tools specifically for AKs are fairly expensive in terms of tooling, as well as you have to like know how to use these tools. So the Plastikov sort of lowers the skill curve and definitely lowers the tooling investment that you'd have to go through, and it ends up with something that will work for my first prototype Plastikov did 2.5 thousand rounds before it ended up cracking. But I had printed it in PLA, which is a corn and soybean based plastic for essentially designed for prototyping in 3D printing, and it's not it doesn't boast any sort of particularly great strength. It's a cheap, crappy plastic that's used for expedient design of prototype parts. So if it did 2.5 thousand in PLA, if you printed it in something more suitable like a nylon, you would automatically just expect it to last longer than 2.5 thousand rounds. So the Plastikov was sort of a interesting foray into something that for a long time people believed wasn't even close to possible, and then you end up finding like it's not only possible, but it actually works pretty well.
Right. And now I'm a dummy when it comes to guns. I've obviously been around so many firearms in my life with my work, but I'm not like a gun nut. I'm not particularly interested. I don't, it just doesn't mean much to me. All I need to know is that round going to go through my plate? If it hits me, what do I need to listen out for? So explain then to me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, like a lot of Brits, we know nothing about guns, most of us, because, we're not allowed to own butter knives. So, you know what I mean? So maybe explain to us, what is the role of the receiver and what is the role of the lower?
So the receiver, as far as like the ATF, so the ATF is the regulatory body in the United States that actually defines what the firearm part that I had mentioned before is. So the ATF has their own arbitrary definition that they define a receiver as. And in most cases, the part that they regulate doesn't actually fall under that definition. And there's been a little bit of scrutiny in court cases about that with the ATF. And in fact, the ATF has dropped out of pushing charges against people who are making machine guns because their legal defense was making the argument the definition of a firearm of this receiver in your own law doesn't apply here. So there's a little bit of like the law says one thing, but the ATF says the other. But from a firearms design standpoint, the receiver is a component that, generally speaking, holds together all of the other assorted components. So in the case of the AK, the receiver holds together everything. So it holds the barrel and the front trunnion and the rear trunnion. It holds the bolt in place. It holds the recoil spring in place. And in some cases, it holds the stock in place. So really every part of that gun, it ends up having something to do with holding it in place. The receiver in an AK really even holds the magazine in one dimension. So the magazine would otherwise, if it's non-constrained, it has 3 degrees of, three directions and 3 dimensions it could move. But the receiver restricts one of those dimensions. So the receiver is actually doing, in the case of an AK, a lot in terms of being, it's like if you want to think about it like the skeleton, where, all of your ribs inside of your body are like the components that come off of it. But like your spine is sort of the receiver where everything tends to be built up off of it. And people like to get off into semantic arguments like, well, a gun wouldn't fire if it didn't have a barrel, so a barrel's a more important component than a receiver. And like the easy counter argument is, go ahead and fire an AK without a receiver. You can't. You could try, and it would probably end up resulting in you blowing something up, because the receiver does have an important role to play in making sure things are in the right place. So when I say lower, on an AR-15, there's an upper and lower receiver. In the AK, it's just all one receiver. And that's how like firearms used to all be just one receiver. So like you think about your bolt-action rifles from World War I, all of them were just a receiver that the barrel and magazine and trigger group and bolt and everything runs off of. The AR-15 has an upper and a lower receiver. And a lot of modern firearms sort of follow this pattern of the lower receiver, generally speaking, will hold the magazine, and it'll hold the fire control parts, and sometimes it'll hold the recoil spring assembly. In the case of an AR-15, it does hold the recoil spring assembly. And then the upper receiver is really just, it holds the barrel in the right place, and it gives the bolt travels inside it. As the bolt reciprocates or travels, it does so inside of the upper receiver.
So then this is why your receiver and the lower whatever is so quote unquote problematic, right? Because what you're doing is making this rifle, or at least the parts for this rifle, without serial numbers, right? You can print it yourself, so it can't be traced or anything. Is that right?
Right. So like the way I just explained it just sounds like an innocent sort of geeky thing, but the way people who would not want you to have these things would sell it to you is like if you print the receiver, you've made what gets called a ghost gun. So the receiver itself is the only thing that it would, if you bought it at a gun store, the receiver would require you to go through a background check, and it would require you to fill out information, and that receiver, whoever actually manufactured it, would have to put a serial number on it and have the ATF be aware of that serial number's existence. So there's quite a bit of regulation that goes into it that way. But ever since the foundation of this country, there's been no actual legal requirement for an individual manufacturing a firearm for their own personal use to have any sort of registration or any sort of serial number or any sort of background check involved in that process. So, dating back to however old you want this question to be, did the United States exist before the Declaration? Did it exist before the Revolutionary War, rather? Or was it after the war, before the war that, our laws became, our country gained sovereignty? Regardless of how it is that you think that shakes out, at either one of those points, the United States had a legal structure that made it perfectly legal for you to make your own gun. Although in current times that ends up being spun by people who don't want you to have guns as, look, they're manufacturing guns without background checks or without serial numbers. And there's this concern raised about like traceability. Like, let's say someone were to print a gun and then they were to go and shoot some rival drug dealer or something with it, and then they were to, for whatever reason, just drop the gun on the ground and leave it there instead of keep it with them. Like, if the police recovered that gun, they'd essentially have no first step to go on as far as tracing. Normally the way that would work is if there was a gun that was dropped that had a serial number, they'd go and phone up the ATF and find where that gun was first sold to. So the manufacturer, when they sell it to a distributor, and that distributor to a gun store, those transactions are kept on paper. And the ATF can then go and trace it to the gun store, and then even to the first person who bought it from that gun store. From there, the ATF just has to rely on word of mouth if the gun is sold third party to third party, because in most states in the U.S., if you sell third party to third party, you don't need a background check. So the point of that being, the ATF at least has some chance of trying to go and track that down. Whereas the fear is, with a 3D printed gun, if it was just left at a crime scene, they'd have nowhere to go. Of course, we realize, like with most printed guns, I was talking about how they need a parts kit. Realistically, the ATF could go and search through sales of, they could subpoena and or have companies voluntarily divulge parts kit sales record. They'd know what plastic it was printed on, and so they could go and ask Amazon, like, who in this area has bought this kind of plastic. So, like, the ATF, if they actually recovered the gun, would have a whole slew of options as far as actually tracing this thing down goes. They just wouldn't be able to do it the old school way. And so that's really what that untraceable question means, is that they wouldn't be able to do it the lazy way. They'd actually have to do like serious police investigation work, which I guess maybe they're opposed to, but that's really what that question of untraceability means to them.
With bearing that in mind now, I mean, I don't know about the laws, but it sounds illegal to do this. But you've said online that it's not illegal, right? What is the situation with the whole legality of these things?
So with 3D printed, not only just 3D printed receivers, but 3D print as much of a gun as you'd like here in the United States, federally speaking, is entirely legal. So since the foundation of this country, legal to make your own gun. The technology that you use really doesn't matter. You just have to stick within the existing laws for any firearm. So generally speaking, the way that works is like, the quick way that you can check that is if you could legally buy it and own it, you can legally make it and keep it.
Is that the same all over the US?
Federally speaking, yes. But state to state, there are individual states who have put additional regulations in the way. So for example, in California, you cannot make your own gun unless you get permission from California's Department of Justice first, and then they'll give you a serial number that you're required to put on the gun that you make. So it's an entirely voluntary law. So if you just wanted to make a gun, it's not like California would stop you from making one, but you would get in trouble if you didn't get a serial number from them in advance. New Jersey, for quite some time now, has had it be completely illegal to manufacture any gun in the state unless you are federally licensed as a manufacturer of firearms. But again, that's sort of a situation where if you wanted to make a gun, it's not like they're stopping you from making a gun. They're just making it so that if you do make a gun, you'll get in additional trouble. So there are state-based laws that are aimed at punishing you should you actually go and do the thing, but it's not like it's stopping any criminal or even any peaceful person who would otherwise not be a criminal from making a gun.
Okay. Now, you kind of mentioned at the start about the various polymers and whatever, about what goes into the Plastikovs specifically, but maybe you can go over how was this made, how was it designed, and then how did it become functional. Now, disclaimer, I'm not trying to get anyone to make one or anything like that, and I'm not saying, oh yeah, everyone go out and do it, but I think it's needed to explain this because some people are acting like, wow, everyone can now just 3D print an automatic, semi-automatic rifle. In the interest of journalism, I want to find out what really goes into it, because that is not quite how it works, right?
Right. So in the U.S., like the too long didn't read version of it is, actually you can just, there's always an air quotes around just, but you can just print your own semi-automatic rifle just like that. But as far as like the geeky in-depth look at it would be, my design process started out at, I took a true to spec AKM CAD assembly. So it's just an AKM drawn and computer-aided design software. And I drilled down straight to the receiver, and I looked at the receiver, sort of how it was laid out. And I made note of, these are what the critical dimensions are. So this is where a pin goes. This is where something's mounted to. This is geometry that I cannot change. I cannot reinforce. It has to be this shape. These two places have to be this far apart, that sort of thing. And so that's sort of how you sketch out your workspace. So stuff that isn't, like, I call it critical geometry. So stuff that isn't critical geometry, you can reinforce, you can change, you can make it a different shape, thicker, narrower, you can make it angled, you can make it look cooler than the flat surface it was before. So that's all up to the designer to modify. So I took the standard AKM CAD assembly, I opened up my handy dandy Google tabs, and I went and looked up, what are some mechanical properties? So like tensile strength and bearing strength are particularly important to firearms design of receivers. And I went and looked at what are the mechanical properties of mild steel, and then mild steel that's been hardened to the proper spec to be an AK receiver, as well as what are the mechanical properties of common printing plastic. So I specifically sized this for PLA plastic. PLA being essentially one of the weakest plastics, because if I design for the weakest and a stronger plastic, it'll do much better. So I had found that essentially PLA is about 10 times weaker than mild steel. So I thought, on the parts of this receiver that are going to see the full stress that this was designed for in mild steel, if I just make it 10 times thicker or 10 times beefier for the particular force that's going to be applied to it, then I add about another 20% to that 10 times, because 3D printed parts aren't going to be as strong as a solid chunk of PLA is going to be stronger than a 3D printed chunk of PLA, because there'll be little air gaps and little imperfections as the 3D printer lays down lines. So I worked with that assumption and then sized the receiver for that and made it bulkier, printed my first revision out. My first revision ended up breaking. It ended up taking me 3 or 4 more revisions as I increased sizes in some place and decreased sizes somewhere to keep it so the receiver can flex where it needs to and will stay rigid where it needs to. And it ended up being quite a bit of design work. But by the end of the design work, you end up with this model of the receiver that can be printed. So the work then for the designer becomes, you have to document. So you have to state what you did, how you did it, how is it that you would have someone else repeat these results. And key to the Plastikovs working is that it's got steel rails that the bolt rides on in the inside of the receiver. And I made these rails, I spec'd these rails so they could just be made out of regular off-the-shelf hardware square tubing that you cut with a hacksaw or a Dremel tool. As well as I had included the CAD drawings for if you have a CNC, like an actual serious hardware, you could manufacture rails with that and not make them from the tubing. So, with those drawing sets and all that documentation, I package it up and then get that posted online for people to download. So that's really where I can answer, at this point, I can answer your question more succinctly. So what a person would have to do is have a 3D printer So most people are using the Creality Ender 3, which is a $200 made in China, essentially an El Cheapo printer, but it is capable of really good results. They would have had to have bought that and then followed, one of multiple setup guides. So we've got our own setup guide that we recommend people use, but there are many options out there. So they'd have to set up their printer to this guide, which isn't terribly hard. It's like IKEA furniture level. And then they would have to download the files. They'd have to read and understand the files. And that ends up being like the hardest part of all of this, is reading and understanding just like the plain English words that the developer writes out. Because people are very excited to go and print their gun, but they're not near as excited to like read about how you do that first. So they'll go and download the files. If they take their time and read the documentation and understand the documentation, they'll then take some of the files that are provided, put them into their 3D printing software, then have the 3D printing software do what's known as slicing. So it'll convert that part into slices that the 3D printer can understand, each layer at a time. And then you take that sliced file and then you go and put that into your printer and then have it print. And so, past the part of getting your printer set up and then understanding how to use the software, it's not terribly hard for the end user. For the developer, there's a ton of work that goes into all of this stuff, not only from the actual design side, but the documentation side. For the end user, once you've got, assuming you've got a printer already made and set up, and understanding that that's not much more difficult than putting together some IKEA furniture, it really does come very close to a click print, and then you've got your firearm. In this case, we're talking about firearm as in just the receiver manufactured. So getting the actual receiver manufactured from a printer, usually not very hard at all. There is additional difficulty then that comes in, though, whenever you're taking that receiver and you're going to assemble it into a working gun. So in the case of the Plastikov, it takes about an hour, and I've got a detailed video coming up on this for an update to the Plastikov download package, where I essentially videotape myself taking a Plastikov's bare stripped receiver and then assembling it out into a complete firearm and demonstrating each of those steps. But it takes about an hour, where you take your AK parts kit and then you assemble it on top of the Plastikov receiver, and then at the end of that hour, you've got something that you'd be ready to go and tear rounds through. So that's probably the closest it comes to like actual work, because you have to know how to use some basic hand tools. But again, like, not much more difficult. Like, if you can put together IKEA furniture, you're definitely capable of either, just straight up doing this sort of thing, or you're definitely capable of learning how to do this thing just by, like, you can watch the video and go, oh, okay, so it's, it's like the IKEA furniture, just a little different.
Right, and I've seen some of these images where I was kind of joking on Twitter. I even made everybody annoyed, but it doesn't matter. But I was kind of joking on Twitter, saying like, "Wow, this is alchemy," because you had some pictures where it was just like, I don't know, buckets of God knows what, all these different colors. Like, it looked very complicated to me. Like, what was all that?
Right. So that was pictures from a project that I jokingly called, but what about barrels? So, like, it would have been March of the previous year, so over a year ago now, we had released the CAD files for the 3D printable Glock frames. So all the things that I've said so far about receivers being the only regulated part, when I say frame for a Glock, understand that it's legally the same object as a receiver. So the frame for a Glock is the one regulated component. Nothing else in the U.S. is regulated. So we had released 3D printable Glock frames, which were sort of another one of these things that people had always said, like, oh, you'll never make that work. And then it turns out that it actually works, really well. And it's probably become the most popular of, 3D printed firearms, these Glock frames. But it was March 17th, I believe, that those files had been released. But like on Twitter, there was an overwhelming horde of people who were mostly European, I hope, who were saying like, oh, but what about barrels? Where do you get barrels from? Like, the barrel isn't printed. What difference does this make? So like, to the American people, you can explain like, you're just an idiot. You can order that barrel online and it'll be here in like 2 days. That's just how living in America works. But for Europeans, they may actually have a point there, because like, to Europeans, this doesn't matter. And so that's sort of the attitude I took, was like, well, if you're European, this has no bearing on your life. Just go back to sleep.
But what about Europeans, although obviously it is illegal, what about Europeans that think, oh, I want to do this, they actually can't print a barrel? Not that they should, cops, not that they should, but you know what I mean, it is a point. Right,
so that's where, but what about barrels really came in. So eventually we got to the point, as in Deterrent Dispensing, our little geeky collection of people who develop these sort of files, these sort of projects, got to the point where we decided we wanted to make a gun that would utilize what, by the European definition of what's a gun part, it would use no gun parts on its parts list for construction. So obviously, after you modify these parts, once you bring them to their final form, they're going to be firearm parts. And a lot of people still don't understand that, because they're like, well, does that mean the gun's legal? Like, no, semi-automatic 9mm are not legal in England. And if you walk out in the street with one, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. But it uses no firearm parts, using essentially a European-wide definition of what is a firearm part when it comes to like what you buy in order to make the gun. So that those pictures that I had shared on Twitter of the pink painter's bucket that was full of like the most disgusting, nasty brown colored water that you've ever seen is a setup that's known as electrochemical machining. So what electrochemical machining is it's technically a natural process. So this happens on essentially any piece of metal that you've ever put in salt water gets electrochemically machined over time. So that's the reason that you can't have, a metal boat can't stay in the salt water in the ocean forever, and it eventually has to be hauled out and rust has to be patched up, and like there'll be holes eaten away in this boat. And it's not by rust, but it's by a process known as electrochemical machining. Then it's electrochemical machining works in the process of electrolysis. And I don't want to get like too far into the geeky chemistry details of this, but essentially you can think of it as because there's a potential difference of voltage between the water and the metal ions will come off of the barrel to satisfy, or metal ions will come off of the metal to satisfy that potential difference. That's like the very super simple version of it. So metal will gradually fall away from the metal. Little bits of metal ions will fall away from the metal. So you can utilize that concept at a very accelerated rate by using a battery or a power supply as your potential difference. So you're not just using like this tiny bits of potential difference that you'll find, in salt water versus the boat. You're using the potential difference of like an actual power supply. So you can take, standard chrome alloy tubing, and this is sold from China as like explosion-proof tubing, which kind of sounds conspicuous, but it has actual use. Like explosion-proof means something in hydraulic tubing. It means that it can see, shock force from, as a hydraulic tube, it can see shock forces from that. In the event that you have like, high pressure hydraulic application that you're working on. So you can buy these tubes from China, and then using a process that was pioneered by an individual named Jeff Rod before I sort of took over, I conferred with him and then took the good things about his setup and then left the bad things about his setup. And then we sort of conferred about how best would we go about something like this. And so, standing on his shoulders, standing on the shoulders of giants sort of a thing, I was able to put together this setup where you can 3D print the tooling that you need. So you 3D print all of the work holding and the fixturing. And the coolest part that you print is you 3D print a little plastic. It's essentially like a little plastic tower that has spirals cut into it. So by spirals cut into it, I mean, it's got, when it prints a spiral groove inside of this tower. And you end up laying copper wires inside of those spirals. And then whenever you put that assembly inside of your barrel and run salt water past it, with an electrical potential difference between the outside of the barrel and then the wires, it will electrochemically machine the groove held by those wires into the barrel. So if you're understanding what I'm saying, you 3D print a tool that has rifling grooves in it, you put copper wires in those grooves, you do electrochemical machining using that tool, and you machine rifling grooves into this barrel, into this tube. So you go from just a plain steel tube, it's chrome alloy, it's hardened, a good candidate to be barrel material, and then you use this electrochemical machining setup to put rifling grooves into this barrel and to bring the barrel to the proper inside diameter and to give the barrel a chamber so a live round can fit inside of it. So you go from an unregulated, it's just a standard hydraulic tube, to you've made yourself a suitable handgun barrel. And I've done a bit of testing as far as, the velocity of projectile shot from that barrel. It's on par with what you would expect from a factory barrel. And I've done accuracy tests with them as well. And I've again found it's on par with what you'd expect from specifically a Glock factory handgun barrel, in equal length barrels when comparing the velocity and accuracy. So it's like a very promising, in fact, I even go beyond promising and say it's a well-proven process that was sort of put together that offers in the presence of a barrel regulation or a barrel ban, you can use a 3D printer to print you specialized tooling for like 30-40 cents. It doesn't cost hardly anything at all to print one of, I call them a rifling mandrel, these towers with the rifling grooves printed into them. It costs you barely anything to print one, and then you can use that tool to machine rifling grooves into hardened chrome alloy steel, which is cool because normally cutting hardened chrome alloy steel requires a very beefy setup because that's hard stuff, that's strong stuff, and it's difficult to machine it using traditional tools. But electrochemical machining does not care how hard your workpiece is. It cares about how it's technically called its valency, but you can think about that as how well the piece of metal conducts electricity. So chrome alloy steel conducts electricity well enough so you can machine it using a little 3D printed part with some copper wire.
That is an incredible level of knowledge you have over all of this. And I noticed you've been saying like we did this. Who is we? Who are you doing this with?
So it's sort of a royal we. So essentially all of this project, like I mentioned, I'd conferred with Jeff Rod as far as like, I went from the complete novice to like, okay, I understand what I'm doing very quick, thanks to him. But it's the royal we when it comes to the actual design of this process. So I came up with the exact process itself using inspiration and advice from Jeff Rod, and then developed it to the point where it's like a repeatable process, and then did all the documentation on it. But like the sort of we I refer to is like, I guess, Deterrent Dispensing. And I was designing this barrel specifically around the FGC9 that Jay Stark was working on at the time, because he was envisioning this gun that I was talking about earlier, the gun made from no regulated firearms parts based on the EU definition of that term. That ended up becoming, that's what the FGC9 ended up becoming. And so I took up the mantle of designing the barrel and the barreling solution for that. And so what I mean when I say that is like, I took up the task of, we can buy ourselves an unregulated hydraulic tube and we know that we want to make it a barrel. What happens in the middle? And so I took upon myself the task of, determining how it is that you go from tube to barrel.
Right, but like going back to these kind of groups, you are a part of like, you have it kind of tongue-in-cheek. Yours is Deterrent Dispensing, right?
Right.
Yeah, maybe just talk about them guys. I mean, I'm not asking you to pinpoint anyone specifically, but there is a group of you. I follow a few of you guys online. Like it's very this whole thing is just fascinating to me as a journalist. It's very interesting to see it develop and also to see the reaction to it, which we'll get onto. But maybe just tell us a little bit about your guys and the other people involved.
Sure. So Deterrent Dispensing is like the elevator pitch version of it is it's a decentralized collective of like devoted individuals who've got skills in any number of things. So some people are just strictly developers. So what they're really good at is coming up with these files and these designs. Some people are really good at documentation. So they're really good at explaining to you on a very basic level of how you take a design and you make a gun with it. Some people are like we call them like signal boosters, or they're like the propaganda arm. So they're good at like telling people, spreading the good word, if you will. Whether or not you believe the word is good or bad, it's the good word to me. And we've got sort of people who are like security, privacy experts. So they're kind of good at these sorts of technologies that allow us to navigate and have secure channels and collaborate very effectively. So I'm sure you may be aware, but we collaborate a lot on a service known as Keybase. And the privacy details don't really matter a lot to me as an American, especially one that I'm sure is on a large number of watch lists already. So it doesn't make a huge difference to me in terms of privacy, but it does to a lot of people who wish to remain anonymous. So if all they're here to do is learn how to make a gun and they don't want other people knowing that they know how to make a gun, that Keybase platform sort of offers them that ability so they can still be helpful in terms of providing feedback and letting people know like, hey, I made this and I noticed these things while making it. Maybe these could be improved in a future version, without like immediately outing themselves as like, this is where I live and this is my IP address, like you would if you like tried to collaborate over Twitter or something.
Right, and then why do they feel the need to stay secret? And I'm 100% not against anonymity, especially online. But why do they feel that? What, they're criminals or they want to be private? Why?
For most people, I'm sure it's a mixture of multiple things. So if I had to this isn't like a straight guess, because of course I've talked to some people and heard some people's concerns. Like, one of them is people don't want the government knowing that they have guns, which at least to me as an American is totally understandable. And I am in that same boat, although I'm sure at this point, like, the chances of the government not knowing that I have guns is extremely slim. I'm sure another reason is for some people what they do isn't legal, so they're peaceful people, I do believe, but because of the fact that they're making firearms, they are criminals. So they would not be criminals if not for the fact that they're interested in making guns. So, like, we have people in California who have printed guns without getting serial numbers from the DOJ. We've seen people who at least claim to be from New Jersey who are making guns, who have taken pictures of their 3D printed guns next to what looks like, welcome to this town in New Jersey road sign, like, oh, you're asking for trouble, but I appreciate the trolling effort, as well as, there's some people who live, not in the United States who are engaged in these things. And there are legal routes to print guns in Canada, but much beyond that, it's very, very hit and miss, and more often miss than hit as far as it being legal to make firearms anywhere else around the world. So, there's people who outside of the U.S. who don't have the proper licensing or permission to be making guns, who are making guns and want to remain private for those reasons.
And that is, of course, highly illegal, and I'm not one to be moralizing, it is what it is, but you've caused a lot of controversy. We can't pretend that isn't happening, and I don't want to get too bogged down in the politics of it. This is not a politics podcast. This is about conflict, and a 3D printed gun certainly is in that remit. But a lot of people are very angry at you for doing this. Why are you doing this, Ivan?
So, without sounding too fanatical, it's my personal belief that I don't necessarily believe that everyone should have a gun, right? Like, I recognize, pedophiles having guns isn't a good thing, but I also believe that pedophiles shouldn't be alive in the first place. But I believe that the way that politics ends up necessitating things is it generally ends up being everyone can have this thing, or only the super rich. So I guess I'll start by saying everyone can have this thing, or no one can have this thing. And in the cases where no one can have it, we understand that the super rich don't have to abide by laws like that. Like, drug bans don't apply to the super rich people. Even bans on possession of contraband beyond drugs never apply to super rich people. And sometimes there's avenues for super rich people to own things. So contraband, like firearms in most of Europe, if you're rich enough and you have enough connections, you can end up owning a firearm and have it be perfectly legal. But it generally requires you be rich and of decent social standing. And in some cases, you have to know a guy who knows a guy. And so with that understanding of the way that government regulation ends up working, I would rather see a world where everyone is able to have a gun, or at the very least is able to have the knowledge of knowing how to make a gun, than a world where the only people who have the knowledge to know how to make a gun are the kinds of people that have excessive amounts of wealth or power, as well as the number one groups of people who have wealth and power in the world are governments, right? And I can't help but look at the fact that it's really hard to pick a government in this world that hasn't done something unspeakably atrocious in its history, and that then won't apologize for the fact that it's done something unspeakably atrocious in its history. And given the fact that that's a thing that has happened with pretty much every country, I personally don't feel comfortable trusting any government around me if I can't have some balance in that power struggle that is the government's the government's power versus the people's rights. Because I don't think that your rights can exist with the presence of total government power. And on the flip side of that coin, I will acknowledge the fact that government power cannot exist in the total presence of your rights. So there is obviously a balance in the power struggle there that really has existed, in my mind, as long as government itself has existed. But I believe that firearms offer you some balance in that equation. So if we are to draw the line where your rights end and the government's power begins, I believe that firearms help draw that line more favorably for people's rights, as well as help make sure that that line can't suddenly shift massively against the citizens' rights. But of course, that it then understands, the easy counter argument to that is, does that mean that you're going to shoot the government if they like move against you in this tiny way? No, probably not. I mean, historically speaking, we've seen that usually doesn't happen. But historically speaking, we have seen firearms make a difference in instances like that. And I believe that the chance to have that happen, however unlikely it may be, is more important than the potential danger that you risk by having this sort of knowledge, this ability to make a firearm be an equalizing thing among all people in your society.
I mean, what was it Marx said? What was it? Under no pretext.
They should free men ever be, or the working class, whoever, be denied access to arms.
Right, yeah. But with that said, people might say, well, you're just saying that, especially talking to me, you know. I mean, everyone's always saying, oh, you're an anarchist. I've never publicly stated my political ideology because I think it's a lot deeper than one ism or schism. But people might say, well, you're just trying to make, you know, yourself seem like, you know, you're appealing to a certain amount of people. I mean, what would you say?
I guess, like, and again, it's like difficult to justify this because, like, my easy way out there would be like, if I was like here to get attention, I'd probably get more attention like posting foot pictures on OnlyFans or something. Like if all I was here to do was like get attention and cause trouble, there's a lot better ways to do that than like spend a lot of personal time and a lot of personal money on developing, you know, 3D printable firearms. Like, you know, I believe, you know, I have this vision of this world and that I would like to see in these strongly held firm beliefs. And I saw a way, as recently as like 2-3 years ago, like I really saw like I can make the world at least move in a very small way towards the way that I want it to be through a very deliberate action, a very deliberate specific action on my part. And so I sort of took that deliberate specific action, and I was fairly quickly, I mean, it was maybe within the span of 6 months, I was rewarded by seeing like people had taken my work and then used it to make guns. And they weren't necessarily there, you know, like the poster child of while that rant that I had just had would be like a person who's like a persecuted minority in a particular authoritarian regime makes a gun and then shoots the people that comes to take them to whatever their re-education camp is. Like that kind of person I haven't necessarily seen make a gun yet, but I've seen people in the US make guns, and that sort of like reaffirms my belief that there's at least some interest somewhere in that people have, even if it's like, let's say it's just totally localized to the US. You can at least see some people who identify with this culture and this idea that I'm professing, and that sort of affirms my views in this way. So like the detraction that I'm just sort of doing this sort of thing for attention doesn't really seem to make sense to me, because I feel like there's a lot better ways to make attention than spend a lot of your own money and a lot of your own time on something that you don't earn time or money back on.
And to your credit, like I saw that argument the other day where you basically, you know, you kind of came out and said, fuck Nazis and fuck like Soviet communists. Like I agree with that as well. Like this is anti-fascist, anti-tanky. I hate them all. And, you know, I saw a lot of people were like, I hate Ivan now. And it was like, you know, you didn't have to do that. I get that. But these people can use what's going out there. And I struggle with this, right? Because I think, like, I'm pro self-defense. I'm not particularly pro-gun. I just think any self-defense is absolutely a must for anybody who wants to be a free person in any society, whether that comes from self-defense physically or otherwise. I think that's an important part of being free, you know, as a people's. But I often think if 3D printed guns, specifically now the Plastikov, what you've made now, if the lads on the block that I am from got hold of them within a week, and trust me on this, they would be shooting up the place everywhere. It would be chaos. So it's a hard one. I mean, what would you say to that, I guess?
Well, like, there's obviously cultural differences, right? And you know, people always say that, like, well, I'm not indoctrinated because I believe that people should be free. And like, the reason you believe that is actually probably is just a result of indoctrination that you interpreted differently. So like the American idea of being free or being a patriot is very different than like the German idea of being free and being a patriot. I'd gotten into an argument with a guy from Germany, and he was arguing that like freedom and patriotism to him meant like you go and pay more taxes than anybody else, and you help the government make sure that everyone around you is safe. And I couldn't help reading that like, no, that's not what it means. But then I sort of realized, like, I took a step back and I was like, well, think about, if this dude's like, his profile picture made him look like he was about 30, and I was like, given his age and where he grew up, maybe he actually believes that's what freedom and patriotism is about. Is that's how he sees the world that he wants to see come about. And that was sort of like I like to think like, oh, I'm not brainwashed, and I'm not just some product of the system that I came from, but I've like completely embraced, like, I am just a product of, I was made by this system that I was born into, and I can't help change that fact no matter how hard I want to. And so, like, I realized the fact then, getting back to your original question, that there are people who aren't sort of acclimated to this culture, like this idea of a firearm can be a great power, and this, the Spider-Man thing, like with great power comes great responsibility. Like, there's absolutely people who don't understand that. And I feel like being born in America, especially being born into like this whole Second Amendment culture, you're sort of, that sort of idea sort of like grows naturally within you. And so I totally accept and would even argue in defense of the argument that there are some people who, once given a gun, are absolutely not going to do responsible things with them. As it's the way things work. Just like, if you give a culture that's not acclimated to having, fast cars, like lots of people in America have cars that can, go 200 miles an hour and 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. But America's drivers like do a really, really good job at following traffic laws. Like, it's very rare that you see drag races at stop signs. It's very rare that you see somebody just like lay down rubber and go crazy. It's even extremely uncommon to see somebody going faster than 80, 90 miles an hour on the highway, when we all realize they could be driving much faster than that.
Right. Sorry to cut you in, but like, if you want to get rid of an enemy, no one is going to go, right, let me get in my car and drag race into him. I mean, rarely, it's going to be access to a weapon.
Like, I see what you're saying there. If what you're saying is the analog there between cars and firearms isn't an apt one. And I agree with your sentiment there. I was just sort of highlighting the fact, like, there's like certain cultural systems that make people more responsible when given excessive amounts of power. So like, an American it's much more common, I would argue, in America versus, say Great Britain, that someone would come into owning, a powerful fast car. Like, I went to high school, right? And I feel like I knew at least 10 people who had 8-cylinder Mustangs, right? And I'm sure in the UK that's something that's like a dream car for most like middle-aged white men. Meanwhile, these kids still had like bumps, acne all over their face, and they had 8-cylinder Mustangs, but they drove them, respectably enough to not crash them, which for a young stupid person is impressive. So like, I think that there's an argument to be made for the fact that like these cultural differences are largely what drive what people do with, what people do in response to having that sort of like power, that sort of, you could be extremely reckless or you could be extremely responsible with the power that's granted to you. So I had heard an argument recently from a Chinese guy who had said that he believes that all people in America should have guns, simply given the fact that guns are everywhere in America, and it's a common denominator at that point. But he then made the argument that like nobody in China should have guns because we've pretty much done away with anyone having guns there. Like, the chances that you get into a shootout or someone breaks into your house with a gun is very slim in China, at least when compared to America. And so I feel like I don't agree. I don't agree with that argument necessarily, especially given the fact that China is something of an authoritarian wasteland.
Well, yeah, I was literally just about to say, like, yeah, that's a great argument for him. What about these kids that are getting absolutely smashed up now in Hong Kong, right? Or the Uyghurs.
The Muslims, right. Rounded up into fucking actual Nazi-styled trains and taken away into the camps to be re-educated.
Well, it goes back to what you said about, like, I guess you were trying to say that people's idea of freedom is kind of subjective. But, I mean, I don't always agree with that. I think some things are black and white. You're free or you're not. Sure, there's different levels to that, but I think, you know, there is right and wrong, and that is not right. Like, you know, that brutal state indoctrination of the CCP is not right. Putting Uyghurs into concentration camps simply because they're a different religion is not right. And bombing children in school buses in Yemen like the US government has done and just being like, whoops, that's not right. So, you know, there is right and wrong. It's not all in this kind of like weird space. I do think there are some ultimate like ends to these arguments.
Absolutely. And like, you've presented a really difficult question for me to answer succinctly, at least without like being able to, like, I'm going to have to sit and think about this tonight. Like, your question of like, okay, but there's some people who you would give guns to who, and not necessarily that they would just like murder one another with them, but they would not be smart or responsible with. Like, I'm aware of, you know, like I live in America and I went to a high school and I was surrounded by idiots every day. Like, I wouldn't feel okay with like half the people I wouldn't be comfortable with half the people I went to high school with having guns, especially not when I was in high school with them. But I don't believe that that fact means that they should necessarily be barred from owning a firearm. I just believe that if they actually were in a situation where they needed to have a gun, them being able to access one is more important than my belief that, like, oh my God, I wouldn't be comfortable around them having a gun if they were to have one. And perhaps that comes down to like education system sort of a thing. So like I've always been a proponent of the fact that I really think that American schools should teach gun safety, you know, as part of their curriculum. Like, there's more guns than there are people in this country. Like, you know, we're very cautious about teaching kids, like, you know, look both ways before you cross the street sort of a thing. But like the only time guns are mentioned in school is like, oh, don't touch them. And like, you're also told not to touch the cookie jar. And you're also told like the best analog I've heard came from my grandfather, and he was talking about like in the early 70s, the only sort of like sex ed that was taught in schools was like strict abstinence, like just don't do it. And then you saw like teenage pregnancy rates were like through the roof, and STD rates were like through the roof because kids went and did it anyway because they don't listen to adults, because that's how kids work. And so there was sort of a paradigm shift in most states around the 80s and through the 90s where they shifted to saying, like, instead of don't do it, they were like, this is what can go wrong if you don't do it safely. This is how you do it safely. Please make an informed decision. And you see STD rates drop, and you see teenage pregnancy rates drop, like, to today, like, astronomically quick, at least compared to where they were in the 70s. And I feel like instead of like an abstinence style education around firearms, I feel like at least like accidental shootings, you could help solve a lot of them by teaching kids, like, this is how you don't touch a gun. Not a great idea, but if you are going to touch a gun, don't point it at your friend before you pull the trigger to find out if it's loaded. Even as simple stuff as that.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you know, like Catholics, I mean, I can say this because of family, whatever, like, you try telling a Catholic don't fuck, they'll come out with 10 kids next week. Do you know what I mean? And that's right. A God thing. So the fact that there are so many, I mean, it's hard. It's like, oh man, that seems a shame to even think about. And I'm saying this from a British point of view. Obviously, it's a different culture. But it does seem to me like, yeah, if there is more guns than people, surely you want to teach people gun safety. Like, surely. That to me doesn't seem controversial.
Oh, it's extremely controversial, oddly enough. Like, you'd think this is like not even a partisan issue, but the thing that hangs people up is usually two things. The first one being they don't think that they're, when I'm talking about they and they're here, it's the kind of people who don't want guns in society at all, are like vehemently opposed to their kid knowing how a gun works, because in order to know how to handle a gun safely, you need to know how to use a gun. It just sort of, one fact necessitates the other. They're not happy with their kid knowing how to do that. And then the other fact is, I would also advocate that, while I realize like the means of this are like totally improbable, like the logistics for it are like not going to ever happen, I feel like it would also be useful for, if your parents are okay with it, every kid going and having like a field trip to a shooting range where they each have a one-on-one instructor, just let them shoot maybe 5 rounds through a gun. So that way everyone knows exactly what it's like. So, if you're ever in a situation where there's a gun around you, you are completely comfortable picking it up and unloading it and making it safe, if that's what needs to happen. So that's my like controversial, crazy view on the fact that there's more guns than people here, and I for some reason believe that everyone should know how to make one, render one safe if they run into one.
It's do you know what I've just been thinking, like listening to what you're saying, and I think a lot of it comes down to personal, who you are as a person, your personality, your character, and life experience. Because like what you've just said there, even I'm thinking, whoa, man, like take kids to a shooting range. But then one of my best friends is a Kurdish guy, and I remember he's no interest in weapons whatsoever, and he was like, oh yeah, we learned to shoot when we were like 11. It's standard, like you know what I mean. So it comes down to your environment and all of that. But anyway, getting back onto the whole, 3D printed guns. You said there, like, oh yeah, you're 3D printing these guns, and your philosophy is that the government shouldn't have the power, or at least if they have it, you should have it. But in like some kind of crazy civil war situation, you're not going to draw for the Plastikov, right? You're going to draw for the AR, like a real, like I don't want to say real weapon, but like a standard gun.
Like almost definitely, and then this opens like a whole nother door to this debate, the way that this argument works in the United States, and that being like, it's important, at least in my mind, that should things really kick off, that you as an individual have a firearm that the government isn't aware exists, at least one. And there are routes to like make those out of metal, like make them in air quotes proper, the right way. And those being 80% receivers, which if I'm sure some elements of your audience won't be familiar, but earlier I had talked about the fact the ATF decides what is and isn't a receiver based on their arbitrary laws that they don't really follow. They assume that the law means one thing even if it doesn't say that one thing. So the ATF had been asked in the early mid 2000s, if an AR-15 lower that has several machining operations left to do, and these machining operations in question are milling out the trigger pocket and then milling the fire control group holes. The ATF was asked, so if you have an AR lower that doesn't have those milling operations finished yet, is it a firearm? And the ATF waffled for a little bit, and then they eventually said, well, okay, yes, then it's not a firearm. So that became known as an 80% receiver. And the 80% is a marketing term that's meant to suggest like 80% of the machining's done and you just have to do 20% of it. But it doesn't actually mean anything. Like there's not actually a percentage that the ATF says like everything up to this point is fine and past it's a firearm. The ATF just like it's not a receiver, or it's not a firearm, or it is a firearm to them. It's not like 80% of the way to being a firearm in their mind. They don't recognize percents. It's just a yes or no. So in the U.S., there's a large number of configurations you can get 80% receivers in. So you can get 80% Glock frames, or 80% AR-15 lowers, or 80% AK receivers even. So you can then end up making your firearms, build them out on these 80% receivers. 3D printing sort of offers just one other avenue to do that, and we realize it's not necessarily as strong as 80% receivers, but it's definitely more economical. It's like assuming you're going to build more than like 2 or 3 guns, your 3D printer will have paid for itself, and then anything past there, you're saving money versus an 80% receiver build. As well as the 3D printer offers you a 0%, if you will, approach. So a 3D printer starts from something where there isn't a clear point of regulation. I fully believe that come next election cycle, and after next election cycle in the U.S., the 80% receivers are going to be regulated away from legality. Just one way or the other. Essentially, it doesn't even matter who, president-wise, who wins. I feel like the 80% receivers are going to face a tremendous amount of pressure to get them banned. 3D printed parts offer like another layer of the onion, if you will. Like as people who want to take away guns peel back layers before they're trying to get to the middle of this onion and get what it is that they really want. Like if that's total disarmament, or that's like as if they would just stop at the scary black rifles. It puts another layer of this onion that they'd have to peel away, because 3D printed receivers start from 0%. Like there's no, like they can't stop the sale of plastic, and they can't really stop the sale of receiver or 3D printers, because you could make a gun with them, and then they can't, there's no like easy middleman like 80% receivers offer. So as far as like, what gun would you reach for whenever the Civil War kicks off? It is obviously a little bit of a niche situation in the US. Like, would you reach for your 80% receiver, or would you reach for your honest to God, or your plastic one? I probably wouldn't reach for a plastic one over an 80% receiver. That being said, it's nice to have these options, going forward. So I believe that 80% receivers' days are numbered, and that they only ever had numbered days left to be around. And 3D printing sort of offers you that extra alternative if you're someone who didn't hop on the 80% receiver train while it was still legal. So it's perhaps then just another option in that regard. And then it also comes down to like the way that logistics work in the United States. Because receivers are regulated as firearms, there's additional paperwork that manufacturers of them have to go through. There's additional taxes that they have to go through just to make them. Then there's additional taxes they have to go through whenever they try to sell them to a distributor. So there's a lot more overhead that goes around with just receivers. Whereas if they just manufacture the parts that aren't the firearm, so if they make everything that isn't a receiver, what's known as a parts kit, they don't have to pay any of those taxes. They don't have to pay for registration. They don't have to pay for any of those taxes. They don't even have to have a federal license to be manufacturing those parts for parts kits. So there ends up being a surplus of just parts in the United States. So, we saw at the very beginning of this coronavirus pandemic in the United States, like gun stores were wiped out, and there was like people waiting like 5 hours in line to buy a gun, which is like absolutely crazy to me. But like you saw a supply of actual manufactured firearms dry up in like a couple weeks. Meanwhile, these parts kits stayed around, for a much longer time, because manufacturers can make these parts kits much quicker, much more easier, because they don't have to wait for registration and they don't have to pay for the taxes involved with making what's known as the actual firearm part. So for a little while there, where there was the run on firearms, you could get parts kits easily. You could still buy 3D printers easily. And so you could be using this 3D printer in this, this weird situation where parts were easy to get, but firearms themselves weren't, but you could print yourself the firearm component. So I could perceive, in the event of maybe a civil war or a further tightening of gun control laws in the United States, that 3D printed stuff still sees a usefulness in it's for the people who didn't get one while the getting was good, or it's for the people who want to have more than one. So let's say you have your one good rifle, but let's say you want to have 2 or 3 more, because like in this imaginary civil war, firearms become currency, or in this imaginary civil war, you perceive the need to have essentially like burner rifles. So if you don't want to have to take your one good one out, you could take your cheaper one, because there is a little bit of a cost save with building one yourself. Or you perceive a potential event where you can see yourselves getting new parts, because everyone will make a run on guns again in the event of this potential civil war, like we saw with the pandemic, and like we saw with the riots following it. Everyone made a run on guns, but the parts were left where they were. So the parts may still be accessible for people who find themselves needing to come into new rifles, both preceding and following this this hypothetical civil war.
I keep thinking about what you said about like it sounds to me like you're saying if they do come for the guns, at least you have this one they don't know about, which would be like the Plastikov or whatever.
Right, so like an 80% receiver would fill that role, because again, it's the same way. It's not required to be serialized or registered. And I guess the argument I've made the argument in the past, and I don't believe it's a super strong argument, but the government regulatory bodies could seize the sale records of 80% receivers that you bought online or you bought with a credit card. Like they could see that and could try to come track them down. That said, like you could meet them unless they had a warrant, you could just meet them at the door and said, "Nope, I bought them, sold them to my friend immediately. Sorry." And just tell them to go on their merry old way down the street. So essentially, like it would be important to have one like if you bought your AR-15 from a gun shop, and that would mean that the ATF could go to the manufacturer. They could ask the manufacturer for all their records. They could go to the distributor that AR-15 went to, and then to the gun store that the AR-15 went to. And then they could see, like, you own that AR-15, and they could come and ask you, like, do you still have it? And then it comes up to, do you want to lie to the face of an agent who's come to ask for it? That said, I don't know that confiscation would ever go that far in the United States, because if you look at the actual number of employees the ATF has, if they took everyone, so all of their desk jockeys, all of their executives, and turned them all into like beat cops going door to door, it would take them like 30-something years, assuming that it would take them 5 years to pick up an AR-15. It would take them 30 years to pick up all of the AR-15s in the country. So yeah, good luck. That's assuming like they never get shot at, and that's assuming like no one lies to them and says, nope, don't have it anymore. It's like assuming they don't even have to get warrants. So confiscation at this point in the United States is like, it's an utter joke, unless you assume that like everyone will just go turn theirs in. But I would just ask that you turn your attention to how New Zealand's like mandatory turn-in went. Like they were looking at like some cases, they were looking at less than 10% compliance. You're joking to yourself if you think the U.S. will have a higher compliance rate with a gun turn-in than New Zealand.
Yeah, it's way too late for that. The genie's out of the bottle long time ago. And what would you say to people that say like, oh, you're paranoid, man? Like you're talking about this possible civil war, blah blah. Like, I mean, do you actually believe in that? And if so, what do you think to these people that kind of say you guys are paranoid?
Like, I don't think a civil war is necessarily actually coming. That said, especially these past couple of months, you really see the social fabric of the country unraveling, and you see that it really seems like the two great big political factions, if you will, in the United States are having a harder and harder time living with one another, at least living peacefully with one another. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are talks of maybe states seceding from the United States. I don't know that would actually seriously go anywhere because, of course, like there's huge ramifications with that. But I think that being prepared, if anything, these past couple of months should signal to most people that there is a distinct possibility that these sort of things happen again, and they happen more extremely than they happened this time around. And that you being prepared for that, chances it happens, admittedly, probably pretty slim. It costs you $400 to buy insurance for something that there's a slim chance of it happening. It's like a $400 one-time payment to buy your AR-15 for this insurance. If you believe that there's and even a chance of this social breakdown happening, it might not be a bad idea for you to go ahead and get ahead of the curve and then get your insurance against this sort of a thing happening. If you believe that an AR-15 will do you any good. If you don't believe it'll do you any good, I disagree, but you're the one preparing for your eventuality. Prepare for it, as you will. And as for insinuations that I'm paranoid, I mean, I have just as much an access to the sort of things that the United States government has done in the past as everyone else does. And I can't hardly look at those sort of things and like hang my head in shame about the fact that I was once like super proud and like America #1 and this country has never done anything wrong. Because like in school, you're not really taught about the hideously wrong things that your country's done wrong. I think like the Trail of Tears was mentioned once or twice, and it was like, oh, we shouldn't have done that, but Andrew Jackson wasn't a great dude. Anyway, moving on, we've done nothing else wrong. But like they don't tell you about like the bonus army that marched on Washington. Like our country's generals ordered our current standing army to shoot on our veterans. That is absolutely insane to me. Like people say like, oh, but would they really have, would the military really come and shoot at you? Like if you look at historically, they wouldn't even have like a second, they wouldn't even have like a doubt about it. It'd be like, well, okay.
I think you're right, and I think a lot of this comes from, I think America, like no offense, but I think you guys are particularly bad with the brainwashing of like, for the country type stuff, but also we have it over here as well. It's a lack of education. There is, a lot of people right now are saying we need to learn about the way that Britain enslaved black people in schools, and people are like, some people are against it, and it's like, why would you be against that? It's education. It's not meant to be partisan. It's not meant to be indoctrination. It's education. You should teach what happened, and that's that. It should be black and white, in my opinion.
If you don't get out ahead of admitting the things that you've done is wrong, it makes it seem like, and in fact it probably is, that you're hiding them. I think I've argued in the past that, British people who come to argue with me, like, look at how bad America is. I'm like, in my mind, the things that Imperial Britain did are worse than what the Nazis did in terms of like the number of people that you killed in the interests of your own, the country's financial gain makes, in my mind, you look worse than the Nazis. Like, you didn't come right out and say that the reason you're doing it was genocide, but to the Indians, it sure looked like that's exactly what Churchill was going for.
All you have to do is do like 10 minutes research on the concentration camps that Britain set up in Kenya and the unbelievable levels of like completely pointless, just horrific violence done on those people as like sport basically. And it's like, come on now, like let's not pretend we're all innocent here,
Right, and like earlier I had mentioned, like it's really, really hard to find a single country that at one point in time hasn't done like a that's not okay sort of a thing.
Yeah, of course, it's human nature to be an absolute fucking prick, to be honest. To go back to the 3D printing now, you know, we've gone into the politics and the intricate and the kind of technical details, but also I understand that you guys get a lot of enjoyment out of this, right? It's a hobby. That's always what I've seen it as, because I'm aware of Lutty and, you know, I've read about slam shotguns. Just, you know, I'm very interested in zip guns. Just my whole life, I just find it interesting. So I kind of felt like, oh, these guys, it's a hobby.
So I of course I would be lying if I said like there wasn't some sort of like enjoyment that I derive out of doing this sort of thing. Like there's some times where it's like I've been going on like 10 hours of writing out documentation, teaching people how to do things, and I'm like wanting to just pound my head in with a baseball bat so that I may fall into a coma and not have to keep writing. But like there is certainly like especially with like the first shots through the Plastikov was probably the most fun I've had doing this. Like, you know, I set up my little string and then I fired the gun from a string, and then you know, after it fired one shot and didn't break, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm putting this right next to my face and I'm ripping through the rest of this mag as fast as I can. Like, I was so excited to, you know, shoot it with my hands after it didn't blow up in one shot. You know, it's like there's like a little bit of a adrenaline aspect, like, oh my God, this could, you know, this could fall apart in my hands and maybe hurt me, as well as like the aspect of like no one's ever done this sort of thing before and it's kind of cool. As well as, you know, combined with the fact like this might be difficult for some people to, like, if you haven't shot a gun, it can be difficult for you to understand. But like for the same reason that running around in a video game and like running around shooting things in a video game is fun, like running around and shooting a gun in real life sort of has this like, oh, it's cool because of the smell and the recoil and the sound and the, you know, seeing your bullet strike your target downrange. Like that's a very cool thing to experience. And even after you've done it, like probably in my case, like hundreds of thousands of times I've shot a gun, it still continues to sort of be like a, well, that was really cool.
Yeah, and to a lot of people, you sound like a complete fucking psychopath. But, you know, it's in a world full of guns or a country full of guns. I mean, come on, man. Like, I've never fired a gun in my life, but certainly if I ever go to America, I'm going to a fucking shooting range. Definitely. I think I guess it comes down to different personalities, but the idea that someone can't see the enjoyment of it, I guess I don't know, I don't get that, but, you know, to each their own.
Yeah, I mean, I've taken a couple foreign people shooting before even, and like there's only one example of a person who didn't immediately walk away from it with like just like the stupidest grin on their face. Like even shooting like little stuff like a 22, you know, they shoot a can from 100 yards and it blows up and they just have like the stupidest look on their face, like that was the most fun thing I've ever done. And usually like they go into it expecting like, oh, this, you know, I don't understand why someone would enjoy this, and then they come out of it like, oh, like I understand why someone would, you know, spend $1,000 on a rifle and then, you know, a lot of money on an ammo and then more than $1,000 on a scope for their gun just to like shoot at cans. Like, what's the point? And then after they do it, they're like, oh, so you know, it's like any sort of sport or any sort of hobby or any sort of like discipline, even like, you know, I'm sure people could make like equal accusations about like martial arts. Like, you know, why would you spend money on all the athletic get up and money on all the time training and money on all the classes, like just to learn how to punch? How much fun can punching be? And then once you actually like, sort of learn it and like you've grappled with somebody, it's like, oh, like, you know, there's kind of like it's like not necessarily like liberating, but like there's some enjoyment that you can derive from the fact that like you've done something that requires some, you know, some hand-eye coordination, some sort of skill, you know, much the same way, like, you know, shooting a can from 100 yards with a rifle. It's, you know, by the time you're like good at shooting, that's not really that impressive. But like if you miss your first time and then you miss your second shot, but then you hit it on your third, it's like well, hey, look at what I did, you know, and you've accomplished something. And so it's like that same sort of enjoyment like you get out of beating like a hard level in a video game or something. You sort of get that same thing out of like I just landed a shot from 100 yards onto a soda can. Like a soda can's really small, right? I hit a soda can from 100 yards with this little rifle, and that's, you know, it's exciting. It offers you some sort of enjoyment.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to, in this horrible kind of toxic, you know, oh, I believe this, so therefore I can't talk to you vibe that we all live in now. People just need to remember you don't have to understand people's enjoyment, so long as they're not hurting anyone. And people could argue, well, it's a gun. Well, actually, you know, like you hurt more people when you're practicing like Thai boxing than you would shooting a can. But you know, people, we just don't always have to understand each other's, I guess, desires and whatever. I think it's fine. Anyway, one more question I want to ask. There's a lot of people, I get it. Every time I post something about 3D printed guns, I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Oh, yeah, that will break if you fire it 2 times. It's gonna blow your hands off. And I'm like, I thought that once, and then I read about it and was like, oh, that's not true. Like, why is everybody saying this? And maybe give us an idea of how many shots, perhaps, I'm sure you've tested it, how many shots would the Plastikov, for example, take before it, quote unquote, blew off your hands?
So I feel like, starting from the beginning, a lot of people have these opinions because their understanding of 3D printed guns comes from like a very like ignorant, like lacking nuance standpoint. So there's people whose only understanding of 3D printed guns is the fact that in 2013, Cody Wilson fired a Liberator that was chambered in 380, and if you printed it wrong, it could blow up. And that's when they think of 3D printed guns, they think that technology hasn't changed since 2013. Since you and I and the rest of the world realizes that like the Xbox 360 isn't the pinnacle of video gaming technology, like things have changed since 2013. We all realize this. So like there's people that just come from like the standpoint of they don't realize that technology changes. There's also, and these are my least favorite people potentially in the world, like they might even be worse than Nazis. I'll just say that to make it controversial, even though it's not true. They're the people, they're like the fake experts. They're like a person who has used a 3D printer, or even people who use 3D printers fairly often, either in their work or in their hobby, who have never printed a gun. It's important to remember these people have not printed a gun or necessarily any functional gun that's even like a remote comparable analog to a gun. But they're familiar with the fact that plastics aren't equivalent to metal, and therefore they feel the need to let you know that plastic is weaker than metal. Therefore, gun that used to be metal that is now plastic must explode. And it's like the most caveman Platonic thinking you could possibly imagine. Like they don't realize that, of course, there's reinforcement that goes on. Sometimes they're aware of the fact, sometimes that these people are like specifically speaking to the fact that like you can't print 100% of a gun. I mean, there is no 100% 3D printed gun. Even the Liberator requires a steel firing pin. So we all recognize there isn't a 100% printed gun. And so they're just like setting up this straw man of all guns, all 3D printed gun, for something to be a 3D printed gun, it must be 100% printed. Unless it's not, then it's not a 3D printed gun, which is just sort of like a silly semantic argument that if you'd like, I could delineate more later. But they're just like these false experts that feel the need to let you know that something would never work. And even sometimes, like my favorite of these least favorite people will be the ones who will tell you like, oh, there's no way an AR-15 lower would last like 5 rounds. Plastic's weaker than aluminum. It would just blow up and blow off your hands. And so then I can very easily just, quote tweet them with a video of me mag dumping an AR, and my hands very clearly aren't blown clear off my body.
And how many rounds is that? Like a mag dump, like when you're using that AR lower?
30 rounds through an AR-15 mag, but you could get, thousands of rounds or more through an AR-15 lower. So you can put so many rounds through it, it isn't feasible to film it all in one sitting because you'll go through like all of a day, unless you've got 1,000 rounds that you can load into magazines in advance, you'll spend like 3 hours of that video just loading magazines in order to fire 1,000 rounds. So like you can fire so many rounds it isn't feasible to show it off on video and on one single printed AR-15 lower before it has a chance of breaking even. So that's like the second kind of person who tweets out you're going to explode your hands. And there's a third type, and I think it's a little bit less common, but I think they're like the wishful thinker. So they're people who will make the argument like 3D printed guns aren't going to ever work because 3D printers are too expensive. Then you point out like a $200 printer is really all you need. And then they'll sort of like move the goalposts again to like okay, but like the parts themselves are like impossible to buy. And you'll be like, well, no, you live in America. The parts are not at all hard to buy. Like you can be like 12 years old and order these because they don't even check your age when you buy them. And so then they'll move the goalposts to like, okay, yeah, but you will blow up your hands immediately because like at this point they've moved the goalposts so far that they're just like clutching to this last thread, this last chance that they have of having relevance in this argument. And like you can stomp on their fingers as they're clinging to this ledge and have them fall. Just be like, no, they don't blow up in your hands. I mean, I've fired well over 10,000 rounds through, specifically 3D printed guns, and I still have 10 fingers. So I'd say I'm doing pretty good.
We spoke before we hit record a little bit about, you were saying there's kind of like a renaissance was the word you used within the 3D printed gun community. Maybe you can talk about that and what you meant.
Right. So The first, so immediately following the firing of the Liberator in 2013, it sort of spawned like this whole media storm and interest in this sort of thing. And the first type of person who says that you're going to blow up your hands, this is when they formulated their opinions for the most part, because like the Liberator was it. There was Defense Distributed had done a printable AR-15 lower that they demonstrated 600 rounds on. So that was sort of like the state of the tech. You could do an AR-15 lower that was good for about 1,000 rounds, and you could do the Liberator. And not much else by the means of printable firearms. So there was a little bit of development that went into it in open source style groups. Of course, Defense Distributed got stopped by the federal government, which hiccuped their progression. But there were some other groups that furthered development. So we got to AR-15 lowers that could easily would be expected to surpass 1,000 rounds, and as well as some other peripheral designs, so like more grips, more stocks, all sorts of little printable stuff. As well as I think probably the only other printable receiver that immediately comes to mind is a printable receiver for the VZ61 Scorpion. So if you played Call of Duty Black Ops 1, that's the Scorpion from Black Ops 1, not the Scorpion from Black Ops 2. At least that's how I tell them apart, because that's where I learned about the specific guns from.
You're showing your age.
Right, I'll out myself like that. Those were sort of the things that, like, essentially up to like 2017, that was about it. There were a couple other printable designs. That's like the Wash Bear was a printable 22 caliber revolver, which was a double action even. So you could keep pulling the trigger and it would keep revolving the cylinder on this revolver. As well as there was the Songbird, which was both Wash Bear and Songbird are much like the Liberator, where there's almost the entire gun is printed. It doesn't rely on a commercial parts kit. The parts that it would rely on are generic, if you will. So. Even up until 2018, that was pretty much the state of the art. There was also Durwood's AP9, which was what the FGC9 would end up being based on, which was a semi-automatic 9mm carbine, but the AP9 used Glock barrels. So that was essentially the state of the art going into 2018. So after 2018 was sort of like when I got involved and when Jay Stark got involved and a bunch of other people like really sort of saw this calling in the fact that the Fed settled with Defense Distributed. And even though the federal judge in Washington ended up like ceasing their victory, essentially shutting down their victory, and now it's all like still playing out in courts, it sort of spawned this new interest in this movement. And as well as the fact that like I personally think like the big reason more development wasn't done following 2013 is the fact that printers then cost, a printer that would cost you then $2,000 is inferior to the Creality Ender 3, which costs you $200 today. Like printers got 10 times cheaper in those 5 or 6 years, and they got higher quality while being 10 times cheaper. So that was a very significant change. And so it was largely on the coattails of the fact that printers got better, printers got cheaper, and there was this new like media storm interest in the printable gun is back again, that sort of drove interest in people like myself to go and develop more stuff. And so out of this you saw something that had been experimented with before was printable Glock frames. So a guy in one of these previous open source groups had done a 22 caliber Glock upper on a printed Glock frame, but he personally believed that 9mm full power, if you will, Glock uppers wouldn't work on it. That only little 22 caliber uppers would work on it. And so like almost immediately you see this renaissance, like make 9mm printable Glock frames done. Not only Glock 17, but Glock 19, and then Glock 26, and then Glock 43, and then Glock, now we've even got like 40 caliber Glock, so Glock 22. So like that, that umbrella opened very quickly. You've seen Tech 9 AB10 printable receivers, because those parts kits used to go for like less than $100 a piece. They used to be everywhere because no one had a good way to make receivers for them. And then with 3D printing, you now see those parts kits go for over $300 if you can find one. Like we completely demolished the market for those. There's printable frames for the High Point C9s, High Point C380s, as well as frames coming up for the 40 cal and 45 caliber high points. You've seen Mac 11, Mac 10 receivers become printable. You've seen massive improvements in the printable AR-15 lowers. So like 1,000 rounds, like over 1,000 rounds before expectable. Now you've got to the point that, I've demonstrated myself doing a rifle push-up on a 3D printed AR-15 lower. So you take the weakest part of that lower and then you're doing a push-up with the rifle between you and the floor, specifically putting as much stress as possible about the weakest part of that lower, and it doesn't give up, even holding your whole body weight. So you've seen lowers get to the point that they're abusable for AR-15s, as well as the fact that if you didn't get 1,000 rounds from it, you could immediately assume it's because you didn't print it right, or you did something wrong and it wasn't the print's fault. So like really seen big leaps there. Of course, you've seen like the Plastikov. You've seen the FGC-9, which took the AP-9's operating mechanism and then adapted it so that it could use, the generic barrel. And then, like I haven't even mentioned, like the electrochemical machining barrel setup is something that's sort of come out of this renaissance, where it was a proof of concept Jeff Rod had done prior to this renaissance. But now with like everyone can afford these super cheap printers and the documentation's plentiful and thorough, like at this point, I've seen barrels made in France. I've seen barrels made in Germany. I've seen barrels made in the Czech Republic. I've seen barrels made in Poland and in the UK even, and it is as well as Canada. And that's just the people who have given me permission to say where they are and that they've made barrels. There are people elsewhere, even in Asia, who have made barrels using this technique. Like, you've really seen an explosion, even outside the United States, of people who not only can now afford, but now have the inspiration to do these things. And the inspiration, I'm sure, is due in large part to, like, the flashy trailers and the hyped up language and the gun control is dead sort of rhetoric, like, that sort of thing. Maybe there is a kernel of truth in it. Like in all propaganda, there's usually a kernel of truth, but mostly it's just to like hype people up and get them interested. And I'd argue it does like a very good job of that. Like, it informs people about where things are at, and if they're the sort of people who are interested in doing that sort of thing themselves, it lets them know where to start. And so that's sort of what I mean with this renaissance, is you've gone from a thing where like 3D printing was just sort of like this geeky niche thing where you could essentially make guns and or firearm parts that were just like range toys, to the point where it's like, it's approaching the point where it's reliable enough that the only reason you wouldn't take it as your primary choice is just because you're still legally able to get stuff that is better. Like if it came down to something where it's like I have to pick between a .22 caliber factory-made handgun or a Plastikov, when I hear a noise like someone breaking in downstairs and it sounds like it's more than one person, it's going to be the Plastikov. Like 10 times out of 10, I'm given that choice because I can trust the Plastikov to be reliable, and I know it's not going to break because it's not like I'm going to like dump 300 or 400 rounds inside of my own house all in one sitting and overheat it. I mean, at that point, like, you're just going to get a new house anyway, and it's not like it makes a big difference. Like, it's probably, I think the point I've made before is, like, if you need more than 240 rounds in a gunfight, a gun isn't what you needed to bring to that fight. Like, if you fired 240 rounds, like, at that point, it's like, if you don't have some sort of, like, cruise missile or air support that you can call in, a rifle was the wrong thing to bring to that fight, and you should have just retreated in the first place. So this renaissance is sort of, if I had to sum it up, it's taken it from this sort of extremely niche, extremely geeky thing, not necessarily into the mainstream, but to the point where it's something that the mainstream could adopt it, and it wouldn't immediately become like the butt of a bad joke.
Yeah, and I think as well the decentralized nature of what you guys are doing now, I think that's where Cody Wilson fucked up, as well as soliciting girls for sex and paying for it. Like that was a big fuck up. But like you guys are decentralized, right? I mean, if they shot you down, I mean, no offense, but it's like, so what? It's not going anywhere.
Right. If the ATF shows up and says we're here for your guns, then like, okay, I'll turn the guns that they ask for over, or if they have a warrant, they'll just come in and take them. But my development, unless I was getting sued behind their raid, my development wouldn't be stopped. Like, I would be printing more guns tomorrow unless I was specifically told that I'm being stopped from making any more guns, or my lawyer says like, yeah, stop doing that. Then I would like immediately resume work the next day, because it's not like it would really be that big of a setback. Financially it'd be a setback, but as far as like the progress goes, nothing will have been halted, because I could just still keep working on things. Even if like say I was smited by lightning tomorrow, a tornado knocked the house down and I died in my sleep, like my actual contribution to this sort of environment is not strictly necessary. So like there's other developers who are in other parts of the country or even other parts of the world who are working on these sorts of things. So it's not like it's coming from one centralized organization or one, it's not like there's one particular developer doing all the work. It's sort of like this, like, sometimes I geek out about it. Like, it's cool to see especially from like when it's not a project I have nothing to do with. It's probably the coolest part to see. It's like another developer has a project that they've worked on, and they've got it to the point where, you know, their example of this part is working well, and they want to have, you know, more data. So they reach out to the, you know, the general chat on the Deterrent Dispensing Keybase group, and so they'll ask them, you know, could I get a couple testers to help with testing this? And, you know, a couple testers, it's usually about 10. It's not a ton of people that are interested. Will like come and they'll buy the parts kits that they need, and they'll follow the documentation, and they'll all then build a gun. They'll put some rounds through it, test it, and then give feedback to the developer. And the developer can fold in their changes or try and work out any sort of bugs that come along. And then after 1 or 2 rounds of that, we can then publish those files. And those files are like, at that point, you know, you can have like an industry level reliable firearm because it's been tested across multiple different kinds of printers and sometimes multiple different kinds of plastic that it's been printed out of, and it's been tested with different ammo, all in this very decentralized way where it's like 10 different people who each only had to buy one printer and each only had to buy one kind of ammo and each only had to buy one parts kit. But the end result is a part that has been tested on 10 different kinds of printers with 10 different kinds of ammo with 10 different parts kits, and even built by 10 different people to ensure that, like, you know, the difference of tools that you used to build it didn't make that big of a difference. So that I think may even be the biggest promise of the Renaissance, all told, is the fact that there's more collaboration that goes on in this very cool, decentralized way that, you know, I'm sure with some open source softwares, they enjoy the same sort of like a healthy working environment. But I feel like it's not something that you see in many other things in terms of it helps progress get done very, very quickly, very efficiently, into a high degree of polish. Like people end up having an expectation of the things that they download from like the master library will work, and we do our best to ensure that, you know, without a doubt, it will be a good file that you download and it'll be a working part that you get. And, you know, previous attempts at this sort of a thing was sort of a hodgepodge of, it was on the end user to find something that worked, and it may even require you to know how to use CAD or know how to hand fit firearm parts. You know, beyond just like simple stuff like putting a gun together, you'd have to know like, why isn't this fitting together, and then make alterations to it using, you know, real tools. And so that sort of difficulty is taken out of it, and it makes it a lot more, all you have to know how to do is set up your printer and then print the part and then put the thing together. Yeah,
well, Ivan the Troll, I don't necessarily agree with everything you're doing, but I find it incredibly interesting, man. Thank you very much. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap this up?
Oh, geez, I'm not going to do any more grandstanding. I'm going to make that decision now. So I'm not going to tell you like overthrow tyrants and all that fun stuff. But so for now, I'm on Twitter, and my handle is at Ivan_is_back. Who knows how long this Twitter account will last. I think I'm also on Reddit, and I believe my current Reddit name is Ivan T Troll, all one word. But again, like my Reddit accounts, I go through them like toilet paper at this point. Constantly getting banned from Reddit.
All right, mate, brilliant. Thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah, anytime. I enjoy it.
That was Ivan the Troll speaking about 3D printed guns, the renaissance of, and the Plastikov. Obviously, it's going to annoy a lot of people. A lot of people are really against 3D printed guns. Some don't care, some love them. But yeah, it is what it is. I think it's interesting. So yeah, Ivan the Troll, very interesting projects they've got going on there. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider subscribing to our Patreon. You get bonus episodes, access to the community Discord, you get narrated articles, you get access to the instructional Too Cool for J School series, you get all sorts, discount codes for merchandise every time we have a drop. There's a lot going on. And at the same time, you get to support Popular Front. And the more money we get on the Patreon, the more we put back into Popular Front. I'm sure you can see that the production value is going up and up and up. We're doing more documentaries. We're looking at maybe doing a proper like audio podcast series, like as a part of Popular Front as well soon, if the if the Patreon keeps going steady. So yeah, thank you very much to the supporters. But consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. If you don't like Patreon, their leader makes some very weird political decisions based on outrage from a mob on Twitter, it seems. So yeah, go support us at popularfront.co/support if you want to do it that way. Or you can buy our merchandise at popularfront.shop, t-shirts, everything. This episode was sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. Our friends, they're an independent coffee shop selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue 97239. Tell them Popular Front sent you. The episode is also sponsored by Grindcore House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA, one in South, one in West. Check them out on social media at Grindcore House and go and see them. Tell them we sent you. The episode is also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and informing people about historical conflict propaganda. Get prints at propagandopolis.com and use the Popular Front code POPULARFRONT10 to get 10% off any prints you buy there. Follow us on social media, Instagram at popular.front, Twitter at popularfrontco. My Twitter is at Jake_Hanrahan, HANRAHAN, same as my Instagram. I reinstated that, just mostly posting bullshit, to be honest. But there are other projects outside of Popular Front that I will post on there. Yeah, go follow us or subscribe to us rather on YouTube, youtube.com/popularfront. We've got a lot going on there at the minute, many more docs. It's harder to climb with the subscribers on YouTube. We're only at like 20,000, I think, nearly. But do share our stuff. We're shadow banned to fuck all over the place. The whole channel is demonetized. Most of our videos don't come up in the search. You know, if YouTube can't make money off of you, they don't give a fuck. They'd rather hear people talking shit, going into suicide forests and mocking dead bodies than they would like people informing the world about conflict journalism and the world in disrepair. But there you go, that's YouTube. They're effectively hollow and evil, I want to say. But yeah, it's the best platform. So, you know, well, best platform for documentaries and that. So youtube.com/popularfront, subscribe, tell your mates, share the new videos. We've got a Belarus dispatch coming out very, very soon. The new Rise and Fall of the Chop documentary is out there now. So yeah, check us out there. Thank you very much to the following higher tier Patreons. They are K. Hardy Roberts, Alexander, Nicholas Butter, Ron Swanson, JD, Jav, Bastian Gamello Rittmeyer, Ian Froese, James Cully, Michael Akakan, Ethan Reyes, Fitz Madrid, Joe Watt, Alex Northrop, Ed Coulthard, Johnny LaFleur, Clayton Taylor, Hugo Newski, Maxwell Burke, Anthony Kabarik, Mike Barone, Don Wayne, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, Fragile Feeling, Chris Cusimano, Sebastian from the Discord, Degenerate Zero Alpha, D.R.C. Jackson, Trey Nance, don't know why I read that out, the whole thing like that, Charlie, Olin Thorne, Amy Rupert, Rubicon, Prashant Singh, Azad, Frank Austin, I've lost my place, Amelia Me, Christina Ravetti, Moody Al-Rashid, Bill Wilson, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Ari from the Discord, Young Wasabi, Sarushe Hawazi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, Scartoon Music, Stephen Davila, Patrick Bronte, Dan Dunham, Fletcher Tate, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Q-Ball, Lawrence Abrahams, Peter McCormick, Emily Molly, Axel Iverson, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Joanne Stocker. Thank you all very much. Again, if you want to support us, go to patreon.com/popularfront. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Sam Black, aka Son of Old. Check him out at samblackpf.com.